In a grand hall in Nairobi built for polite diplomacy and controlled applause, something extraordinary happened. A young man in military fatigues, no tie, no script walked past rows of presidents, ministers, and career diplomats. Some smirked, a few whispered. One Western official reportedly leaned over and muttered, "He won't last 5 minutes." But then he spoke. We were slaves in silence. Today we speak as builders. And just like that, the air changed. No one moved. No one whispered. It was as if the entire African Union summit had been yanked out of its ritual and dropped into something far more real, a courtroom, a reckoning. IBRAHIM Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso, didn't come with fanfare. He came with memory. And memory, as he would show, is more powerful than any prepared statement. This wasn't a speech. It was a mirror held up to a continent. And to those in the West watching from glass booths and newsrooms, it was a warning, not shouted, not dramatized, just clear, factual, and devastating. If you've ever wondered what leadership without permission looks like, if you've ever asked yourself whether Africa still remembers what it means to stand not just for independence, but for dignity, this is the story you need to hear. Because what began as a mid-year summit turned into something no protocol could predict. You're watching a channel that doesn't speak for Africa, we listen to it. Please share this video if you believe memory matters more than ceremony. Subscribe if you believe that truth doesn't need to be loud to be revolutionary. The Nairobi Mid-Year Summit of the African Union was meant to be predictable. Leaders from across the continent gathered in tailored suits and diplomatic order, seated according to protocol titles and alphabet. The agenda was full of familiar phrases: regional coordination, climate adaptation, economic frameworks. Nothing revolutionary. Just another meeting in a long tradition of cautious consensus. And then came Traore. He entered not as a guest, but as a disruption, dressed not in silk but in the same military fatigues he'd worn in dusty villages back home. He wasn't scheduled to speak at length. He didn't submit remarks for pre-approval. He was barely even expected to draw attention. His seat labeled Burkina Faso was placed far from the central table, tucked against the wall. They said it was alphabetical rotation. But everyone knew it was a message. Still, he walked straight to the podium. No pause, no glance at the moderator, just the sharp sound of his boots on polished marble. Delegates exchanged puzzled looks. Cameras hesitated, unsure whether to record a mistake or history in the making. And then 5 words. We were slaves in silence. The sentence cut through the murmurs like a scalpel. Some in the front row stiffened. Others fumbled for translation headsets. The French interpreter in the back booth stopped mid-breath. Today, we speak as builders. The room froze. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for time. He just kept speaking, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly clear. If you expect me to speak the language of colonial pleasantries, he said, prepare to be disappointed. It wasn't anger. It was precision. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. This, he said, holding it high, is a list of foreign contracts signed over the last decade, agreements that stripped our minerals, poisoned our waters, and left our children with nothing but debt. Gasps. A European delegate shifted uncomfortably. A French diplomat took frantic notes, not to argue, but to record. Africa does not need pity, Traore said. It needs memory and the courage to use it. Still no one moved. No moderator interrupted. No delegate raised a procedural point. It was as if time had slowed, waiting to see what would come next. Traore smiled, not out of pride but clarity. I come from a country, he said, that buried a president for dreaming too loud. But I am not here to bury anything. I am here to build, starting with truth. That was the moment the room changed. Heads lifted. Side conversations ceased. Even seasoned diplomats, those who had tuned out 1,000 speeches before, leaned forward. He's not following the protocol, someone whispered. He's rewriting it, came the reply. And yet his seat remained at the edge of the room. That insult would not go unnoticed. When the cameras zoomed in on the label Burkina Faso isolated against the wall, everyone saw it for what it was: exclusion masked as formality. But Traore didn't sit. He walked deliberately toward the center, toward the seats reserved for the so-called anchor economies of Africa. He didn't ask. He simply stood behind a North African delegate, leaned into the microphone and said, "If you believe sovereignty belongs at the margins, I will stand where you placed me. But speak as if I was born at the center." Silence. No moderator dared interrupt. No protocol officer stepped forward. Then came the blow. Respect, he said, is not a table, it is a circle, and if you keep carving out corners for the inconvenient, the center will collapse. That's when the international cameras shifted, journalists scrambled, the story had changed. This wasn't a headline about Burkina Faso anymore. It was a continental shift, an unscripted disruption of hierarchy. And still Traore hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. He asked the summit technician to display a map, one not in the official schedule. A satellite image of Burkina Faso. Dozens of red pins lit up, each marking a mining site. Percentages appeared: 92% foreign-owned, 100%, 89%. Not a single site majority controlled by Burkinabe interests. Then a French delegate stood, face red, voice strained. This material was not approved. It violates summit protocol. Traore didn't turn to face him. He simply pointed to the screen. That, he said, is exactly the problem. A hush fell across the room. Burkina Faso had been seated at the margin, but Traore's voice had just placed it at the center. The silence that followed IBRAHIM Traoré's words wasn't ordinary. It was dense, sacred, the kind that doesn't beg for applause but demands stillness. He had just exposed a continent-wide wound, not by shouting, not by blaming, but by revealing contract by contract, map by map, line by devastating line. The hall sat motionless. Ministers stared at the red pins on the satellite image. They didn't blink. They didn't breathe. This site, Traore said, pointing to one mining location, produced over $800 million in raw gold since 2016. No paved road, no registered workers, no tax revenue for the village. The water is poisoned with mercury. He turned toward the French delegation. Your embassy issued 3 investment visas to the company that runs it, but not one medical visa for the children it displaced. The French delegate's lips parted, but no sound came out. He sat down, and the room finally understood this was not a speech. It was a surgical indictment. Traore raised a weathered document. Here's the contract. Thin, simple, but lethal. He held it like evidence in a courtroom, not a summit. Then came the final blow. You call it development, he said, eyes scanning the room. We call it disappearance of memory, of control, of pride. And the worst part, you taught us to thank you for it. The entire summit flinched. A few glanced at their devices, not to disengage, but to verify what they had just heard. Others typed messages home. In one corner, a South African minister simply whispered, "Who trained this boy?" The Kenyan delegate beside her answered quietly, "No one. That's what frightens them." And then the tide turned. Traore reached into his jacket again, not for papers, but for something more powerful. A photo. "This is Adama," he said softly. "A farmer from Yatenga. He worked 35 years growing millet. One day he collapsed. His son strapped him to a motorbike and drove 6 hours to the capital. The image showed an older man, gaunt, weary, dust on his skin. At the hospital," Traore continued, "they turned him away. The dialysis machine wasn't broken, it was reserved for a foreign mining executive. The man hadn't even arrived yet." Gasps moved through the room in ripples. In the interpreter booth, a woman translating into French removed her headset, eyes glassy. She whispered to her colleague, "He's not speaking politics. He's speaking blood." Adama died on a bench, Traore said, while his son filled out paperwork. No one clapped. No one coughed. It was no longer a summit. It was a memorial. He never held a gold coin, he added, but he bled on land full of it. Then he paused, just long enough for the truth to settle. If your progress requires Adama to die in the dark, then it is not progress. It is robbery. That was the moment the air changed again. Not by applause, not by chance, but by motion. A delegate from Namibia stood. He didn't speak. He moved his chair from the far edge of the room and placed it beside Traore, a seat usually reserved for power now claimed by conscience. Then another stood, Liberia, then Mali, then Ghana, then Congo. One by one they moved, not by assignment but by choice, not by rank but by memory. It was subtle, no announcement, no press release, but unmistakable. Power was shifting, and no protocol could stop it. In the press booth, one international journalist whispered into her mic, "This is not about policy anymore. This is posture." And it just changed. The moderator, hand hovering over her mic, didn't speak. She knew any attempt to restore order would feel like betrayal. Traore watched them move, ministers, diplomats, aides, all slowly gathering near him. And then he spoke again. This is not rebellion. This is remembrance. He looked directly into the camera lens. For too long we were told to be neutral, objective, diplomatic, but I refused to speak of justice without naming the bodies buried beneath its absence. From the Tanzanian table, a young woman stood. She was only 29, her first summit. Her nameplate read Asha Muini Ministry of Youth. She stepped to the mic. I was told to come here and listen, she said, voice clear but emotional. But President Traore reminded us we're not here to observe, we're here to represent. She paused, hands clasped tightly. I don't have statistics, I don't have reports, but I do have memory. The room knocked in unison, an African tradition of respect. Not applause, but agreement. So to those who say this is too emotional, she added, I say emotion is what happens when memory finally gets a microphone. More delegates rose, not for a vote, but for something older, something sacred. And the chair marked Burkina Faso tucked away at the edge of the room remained empty, because its leader had filled the room instead. The Nairobi summit had not planned for any votes that day. It was supposed to end with summary statements, photo ops, and a ceremonial group lunch. But after Traore's words, nothing followed the script. Delegates were no longer discussing climate funds or logistics corridors. They were whispering about contracts, about documents long forgotten in ministry drawers, about signatures exchanged in colonial languages, about farmers like Adama who died while foreign companies shipped out gold. And in that rupture came movement. Sierra Leone's Minister of Foreign Affairs stood during the closing session and did something no one had anticipated. I move that the African Union establish a permanent sovereignty monitoring task force to review all external agreements, economic security, and resource-based, and to report transparently to every member state. A hush. Then came the follow-up, and I propose that Burkina Faso serve as its first rotating chair. The room didn't erupt, it froze. Even the chair of the AU hesitated. That is, outside the agenda, she said almost cautiously. But Sierra Leone's delegate was calm. It's not outside the moment. Namibia seconded. Ghana added its voice next. And suddenly, nations once silent began to nod. Not for IBRAHIM Traoré the man, but for something much larger, a sense that history had just shifted and demanded they respond. Legal advisors scurried. Bylaws were double-checked. But nothing stopped it. Within the hour, 51 votes were cast. Only one country abstained, the same nation whose delegation had quietly exited earlier. The motion passed. A new organ of the African Union was born. And with it, the continent had created a tool to finally ask the question long avoided, what have we signed and at what cost? But that was just the beginning. Across capitals, foreign ministries scrambled. In Paris, Berlin, and Washington summit analysts worked overtime. A note from a U.S. envoy read, Traoré dominated the narrative. Not with theater, but with receipts. We were not prepared for this tone, or this truth. In Nairobi at the Summit Hotel, an American official approached Traoré's team discreetly. We'd like to request a private meeting with the president, he said, off the record. The response was polite but firm. If he speaks, it will be in front of the forum, not behind doors. Even traditional allies of Burkina Faso realized they could no longer treat the country as a junior partner. Its voice now carried structural weight, but perhaps more powerful than political impact was the civil reaction. That same night in a neighborhood cafe in Accra, students huddled around a small laptop replaying Traoré's speech. One of them whispered, he didn't just speak for his country. He spoke for every village with no clinic, every teacher with no salary, every well gone dry. In Dar es Salaam, an old professor scrapped his prepared lecture and projected the clip of Traoré onto a chalk-smeared wall. He turned to his class of 18-year-olds and asked one question. Do you know the names on your country's mining contracts? No one did. But by the end of the hour, they were searching. In Kigali, a billboard appeared within 48 hours. It showed a silhouette of Traoré with the words, memory is not rebellion. It's a right. In Johannesburg, a group of young mothers launched a petition, their goal to demand publication of all foreign pharmaceutical agreements that delayed medicine to public hospitals. In Bamako, a bus driver taped a photo of Adama Traoré's symbolic farmer above his dashboard. His route passed the local government office. He told passengers, I drive this bus. but he drove the truth. And in Ouagadougou, the heart of Burkina Faso, neighbors gathered in courtyards not to chant, not to protest, but simply to listen. One brought a speaker, another played back the full 43-minute speech. No cuts, no headlines, just voice. An elder woman placed a candle at her feet and whispered. Sankara spoke with fire. Traore speaks with memory. But both lit the same flame. Inside embassies, the impact was no less seismic. Some EU staff quietly updated memos, flagging past agreements for review. Others flagged something more intangible: legitimacy. The danger isn't that he defied protocol, read one internal cable. It's that he redefined what legitimacy sounds like, and people listened. In West African capitals, finance ministers called emergency meetings. Pull every existing contract from the last decade, one ordered in Ghana. I don't want to be caught by the next map. Because that's what Traore had done. He didn't demand loyalty. He forced accountability, not through pressure but precision. And in doing so, he had turned emotion into legislation, storytelling into structure, loss into leverage. The chair of the AU, reflecting on the summit's unexpected turn, said quietly to her aide, "This is not what we planned, but it might be what we needed." In Washington, the room was quiet. At the Department of State's Africa Bureau, analysts sat around a conference table reviewing the full transcript of President Traore's speech. There were no bold accusations against the United States, no shouting, no direct confrontations. But the damage had been done. He didn't attack us, one senior official said. He bypassed us. And that perhaps was worse. Within hours of the summit's viral moment, the U.S. Embassy in Burkina Faso submitted an internal note. Domestic sentiment toward sovereignty has hardened. Civil society is no longer asking for representation. They are demanding review. The West had always assumed it controlled the conversation in Africa through language money structure. But IBRAHIM Traoré didn't fight the West. He simply ignored its framing. And in doing so, he rewrote the center of gravity. In Brussels, there was more panic than strategy. EU media handlers scrambled to respond. A leaked email from a summit communications team read, "The optics are devastating. No response is better than an overreaction." France 24's editorial board debated whether to air Traoré's full speech. One producer argued, if we don't show it, we lose credibility. If we do, we lose control of the narrative. By then, it was too late. Traoré's words had already leapt from continent to continent. Not as a threat, but as a mirror, reflecting back decades of quiet exploitation dressed in cooperation. "You call it development," he had said. "We call it disappearance." In Geneva, UN officials remained publicly neutral, but one envoy reportedly asked his assistant off-record, why didn't anyone vet him? The answer, of course, was simple. They thought he didn't matter. In truth, Western institutions had grown too comfortable, used to African leaders who asked for access visibility funding. But Traoré didn't ask. He declared. That's what unsettled them most. Even the American press took notice. The New York Times ran a headline, "A president with no notes, no filter, and no fear." In Paris, a radio commentator summed it up best. He said things even our own unions are afraid to say. And in London, a BBC journalist covering the summit admitted on air IBRAHIM Traoré did not speak for applause. He spoke for history, and history listened. But perhaps the clearest reaction came not from a politician, but from a retired African studies professor in Chicago. He wrote in a local op-ed, it wasn't anti-West, it was pro-truth. And the West is not used to that. There was no music when IBRAHIM Traoré left the summit hall. No national anthem, no military escort. Just the soft echo of chairs sliding back as presidents, ministers, and diplomats rose not to follow protocol, but to honor presence. Outside in the streets of Nairobi, students and elders waited, not with chants or placards, but with silence. The kind that says, we saw, we heard, we will not forget. Traoré didn't wave. He simply nodded toward them, toward the memory of Adama, toward every forgotten village written out of foreign contracts, every child denied medicine because someone else signed the deal. Inside his hotel room that night, he placed a folded photo next to a handwritten letter. One image, Thomas Sankara seated surrounded by children. One sentence. The ghosts stood today. And for those who understand Africa's long struggle not for pity, but for presence, those words meant more than any standing ovation. Because this was never just about a speech. It was about a continent asking the world, do you remember who we are? And if the answer is silence, then Africa is ready to speak again, this time without permission. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or is the world still trying to mute his voice? You've been watching a channel that doesn't narrate Africa's pain. We remember its dignity. Please share this video if you believe that what happened in Nairobi was not a political stunt, but a turning point. Subscribe if you believe that truth deserves a microphone even when it breaks the rules. And tell us below, should more African leaders speak with this kind of unapologetic clarity?